Margaret Doyle slammed the smokehouse door so hard, the rusted hinges screamed. 22 men stood outside in the Montana cold, watching. Waiting. Smirking. She didn't look back. Inside, it smelled like rot and failure, like every broken promise William Harlan had ever made. The shelves were empty. The fire pit was dead. And she had been sent here to feed an army of hungry, resentful men with nothing but her 2 hands and whatever scraps remained. They didn't want her here. Good. She hadn't come here to be wanted. If this story already has you hooked, please subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The telegram had said 3 words that told Margaret everything she needed to know about the man who sent it. Capable woman needed. Not kind, not pleasant, not even warm. Capable. She had read it twice at the kitchen table of her father's butcher shop in Billings, the paper smelling faintly of pine resin and railroad ink, and she had understood immediately that whoever sent it wasn't looking for a companion. He was looking for a tool. Something functional, something useful. Her father had watched her from across the counter, his thick hands still working a cut of brisket, his eyes careful and quiet, the way they always were when he didn't want to say what he was thinking. "You don't have to go," he said finally. "I know," she said. "Harlan's place is 3 days north. They say the hands are near to mutiny. Say he's bled the ranch dry trying to keep the cattle operation alive when the beef market turned." He paused. "Say he's a hard man." "Most men in debt are hard men," Margaret said. She folded the telegram and tucked it into her apron pocket. She left on Tuesday. The wagon ride from the rail station to the Harlan Ranch took 4 hours through a landscape that felt like it had already given up. The grasses were brown and flattened. The creek she crossed twice ran shallow and reluctant. The driver, a lean man named Cobb, who worked supply runs between the station and 3 ranches in the territory, didn't speak much, but when the Harlan fence line came into view, he exhaled through his nose in a way that said more than any sentence could. "They're struggling," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "They're dying," Cobb said. "Slow, but dying." The main house was large and once proud, built from good timber that had gone gray and unattended. The barn beyond it listed slightly to the east. A water trough near the corral was cracked along one side, the spilled water long since dried into a dark stain in the dirt. 3 horses stood in the corral with their heads low. Margaret stepped down from the wagon before Cobb brought it fully to a stop. She stood in the yard and looked at it all, not with pity, not with dismay, but with the focused, measuring calm of a woman taking inventory. Then the men came out. Not all at once. They drifted from the barn, from the bunkhouse, from around the side of the house, 22 of them in various states of worn clothing and poorly concealed hunger. Some were young, barely past 20. Others carried the weathered look of men who had spent decades outdoors and had stopped expecting anything good to happen. They stood in a loose, unorganized gathering and looked at her the way people look at something they weren't expecting and aren't sure they want. She looked back. Nobody moved. Then one of them, tall, raw-boned, with a long face and a mustache that didn't quite grow in on one side, let out a low, slow breath that wasn't quite a laugh, but wanted to be. "That's what he sent for," he said. The words weren't directed at her. Not exactly. They were directed at the space between her and the rest of the men, designed to be heard, but not owned. Coward's words. She had heard them before in 100 different rooms, in 100 different tones. Margaret didn't answer him. She reached back into the wagon bed, took hold of her trunk by the leather handle, and began dragging it toward the house. "Someone going to help her with that?" Another man said, equally flat, equally designed to sting. Nobody moved. She dragged the trunk herself. It was heavy. Her father's butcher ledgers were inside, along with 3 books on preservation technique. A bundle of dried herbs she'd brought from Billings, and the good knife she'd carried since she was 16 years old. The weight of it didn't slow her down. She was halfway to the house steps when the front door opened and William Harlan appeared. He was not what the telegram had suggested, and not what the ranch's condition implied. He was a substantial man, broad through the shoulders, somewhere in his mid-40s, with thick dark hair going silver at the temples, and a jaw that suggested he had spent most of his life refusing to back down from things. He stood on the top step and looked down at her, and his expression carried that particular combination of desperation and pride that Margaret had come to recognize as the most dangerous kind of man to work for. He needed help badly enough to ask for it, but he resented needing it badly enough to make sure everyone knew the asking cost him nothing. "Miss Doyle," he said. "Mr. Harlan," she said. "You're smaller than I expected." He said it without apology, the way a man assesses a horse he's considering purchasing. "I'm exactly what you asked for," she said. "Capable." Something moved across his face. Not quite respect, not quite irritation, something that hadn't decided yet what it was going to be. "Come inside," he said. "I'll show you the kitchen." The kitchen was a disaster, not a chaotic disaster, not the kind that comes from activity and use, and too many people doing too many things. It was the disaster of neglect, of a space that had been abandoned not all at once, but gradually meal by meal, as whoever had been responsible for it gave up in increments. The cast iron pans were filmed with old grease. The shelves held almost nothing, 2 sacks of flour that had been opened and poorly resealed, a tin of salt that was running low, 3 jars of preserved beans that were years old, a quantity of salt pork that had gone pale and questionable. Margaret stood in the center of it and did not let her face say anything. "This is what you have?" she asked. "It's what remains," Harlan said. He was standing in the doorway with his arms crossed, watching her with the same assessing look he'd used in the yard. "The last cook left in September. Before that, the one before him left in July. I've been managing the food situation myself since then." "You've been managing it toward starvation," she said. His jaw tightened. "I've been managing it toward survival." "Those are not the same thing," Margaret said. She moved to the salt pork and pressed her thumb against the surface. Soft. Too soft. She picked up one of the bean jars and turned it toward the light from the window. "How long have the men been on reduced portions?" A pause. 6 weeks. "And before the reduction?" "The portions weren't generous even then." She set the jar down carefully. "How many men?" 22. "Any of them with skills beyond cattle work?" Harlan's eyes narrowed slightly, like the question was something he hadn't prepared for. "What kind of skills?" "Carpentry, metalwork, anyone who's worked in a butchery or a smokehouse." "Why would I need—" He stopped. Something shifted in his expression, though he wasn't sure yet what it meant. "There's a man named Tully who did apprentice work at a tannery before he came west, and a boy named Jonas who grew up on a hog farm. I'll need to speak to both of them," she said. "You'll need to cook," Harlan said. "That's what you're here for." Margaret turned and looked at him directly, and there was nothing aggressive in her gaze, nothing confrontational, but there was an absolute and uncompromising clarity in it that stopped him mid-breath. "Mr. Harlan," she said quietly, "with what is currently in this kitchen, I can feed 22 men for approximately 9 days. After that, you will have nothing. No food, no function, no ranch. If that is what you want me to manage toward, I can do that. But if you want this operation to survive past the end of the month, then you need to let me work the way I know how to work. And that starts with you showing me what else is on this property." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Harlan stared at her. She waited. "There's a smokehouse," he said at last, "behind the grain shed. It hasn't been used in 4, maybe 5 years. The equipment inside is likely ruined." "Show me," she said. He led her out the back of the house across a stretch of yard that was mud-soft from recent rain, past the grain shed, which held less grain than it should have, and around to a low structure half hidden behind a stand of scrub brush that had grown up around it, unchecked. The smokehouse. It was small, built from good stone with a timber roof that had bowed slightly under the weight of years but held. The door was swollen in its frame from moisture and to put his shoulder against it to get it open. The smell that came out was not unpleasant, not rot, not decay, but something older and deeper. Smoke absorbed into stone over years-old wood-dried herbs that had long since lost their potency. The interior was dim, the hooks along the ceiling beam still in place, the fire pit beneath the hanging rack still structurally sound. Margaret walked in slowly. She ran her hand along the stone wall. Cold. Solid. The mortar was intact. She crouched and looked at the fire pit construction, the airflow design, the depth of the ash basin, the way the smoke would channel upward through the hanging racks. "Who built this?" she asked. "My father," Harlan said. He was standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression she couldn't yet categorize. When he first established the ranch, he knew what he was doing. "He did," she agreed. She stood. "The structure is sound. The fire pit design is correct. Your father understood airflow management, which most men who build smokehouses don't. The hooks are wrought iron, still usable. I'll need the door repaired, the interior cleaned, and a proper supply of hardwood hickory if you have it, but oak will do. I'll also need a quantity of salt sugar and saltpeter." "Saltpeter," Harlan repeated. "For the cure," she said. Your father would have known that. Another silence. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up, could hear the distant sound of the cattle in the far pasture. "This will take time," Harlan said. "The men need to eat now." "I know that," she said. "Tonight I'll make do with what's in the kitchen. Tomorrow I'll have Tully and Jonas begin cleaning this space. Within the week, we'll have the first batch curing." She turned and looked at him steadily. "But Mr. Harlan, I need you to understand something before we go any further." "What's that?" he said. "I can fix your food problem," she said. "I can do more than fix it. I can turn this smokehouse into an income source that could stabilize this ranch's financial position. But I cannot do any of that if you override my decisions, undermine my authority with the men, or treat what I do here as supplemental to the real operation. What I do here will become the real operation. If that is something you cannot accept, tell me now, and I'll have Cobb drive me back to the station in the morning." William Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Nobody had spoken to him like that in years. He didn't know whether he was angry or relieved. "Fine," he said. The word came out of him like something dislodged. "Fine. We'll do it your way." "Good," she said. That night Margaret cooked. She worked with the salt pork, the flour, and the beans, and she made something from those three things that was not extraordinary in its components, but was extraordinary in its execution. A thick, properly seasoned stew that filled the bunkhouse with a smell that made men sit up straighter without knowing why. When she set the pot on the table, the 22 men filed in, the way men do when they are hungry enough that their pride comes second to their stomach, reluctant at first, then quick. The tall man with the incomplete mustache, she had learned his name was Garrett, sat at the far end of the table and ate without looking at her. But he ate. He ate everything in front of him and then mopped the bowl with the last of his bread. Jonas, the boy from the hog farm, was somewhere around 19 years old, with big hands and a serious face. He had watched her in the kitchen while she worked, not intrusively, but with the focused attention of someone who recognizes something they know. "Your father kept hogs?" she asked him quietly, while the others were occupied with eating. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "We did our own smoking. Hams mostly. Some sausage." "Did you ever work the salt cure?" He nodded. "From when I was about 12. "Good," she said. "I'll need you in the smokehouse when we begin." He looked up at her. Something in his face relaxed slightly, the particular relief of a person who has been doing nothing useful for too long and has been offered something that might matter. "Yes, ma'am," he said again, and this time it sounded different. Tully was older 50 or close to it, with the broad, careful hands of a craftsman and the watchful manner of a man who had learned to assess situations quietly before inserting himself. He found her after dinner, standing at the back door of the house, looking out toward the smokehouse in the dark. "Heard you want to get that old thing running again," he said. "I do," she said. "What does Harlan say?" "He's agreed to it." Tully was quiet for a moment. He say it because he means it, or because he doesn't know what else to say? Margaret looked at him sideways. A careful man, a perceptive one. A bit of both, she said. Which is why I'll need to move quickly enough that results speak before opinions can reform. Tully nodded slowly. I can get that door fixed tomorrow morning. Hinges are seized, but the frame's still good. I know, she said. I checked. He glanced at her. There was something in the glance that wasn't quite respect yet. It was the thing that comes before respect, the recognition that someone knows what they're doing. All right, he said. He pulled his hat down slightly and turned back toward the bunkhouse. Tomorrow morning, then. Inside the main house, William Harlan sat at his desk in the study, the ledger open in front of him. The numbers doing what numbers do when there's not enough of them declaring the truth without mercy. He could hear the sound of her cleaning the kitchen. It had been months since anyone had cleaned that kitchen. Months since that room had sounded like anything other than a place where failure happened quietly. He sat back in his chair. He had sent for a cook. He was beginning to suspect, in that uncertain and slightly unnerving way that comes when a situation starts to move faster than you planned, that he might have sent for something considerably more complicated than that. The kitchen sounds continued, purposeful, unhurried, systematic. Outside, the Montana wind moved across the prairie in long, cold sweeps. Inside, something was beginning. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the absolute and inevitable quiet of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, and had known it since the moment she stepped off that wagon, looked at the wreckage of William Harlan's pride, and decided it was worth saving, even if he wasn't sure yet that she was right. The morning came hard and gray, the way Montana mornings do in late October, when the season has already made up its mind about what's coming and doesn't care what anyone thinks about it. Margaret was up before anyone else. She had the kitchen fire going by the time the first pale light started showing through the window glass, and she was at the stove working on a pot of cornmeal mush when she heard boots on the back steps, not one pair, but two, moving with the particular hesitation of men who weren't sure if they were welcome. She didn't turn around. Jonas, she said. And Tully. A pause. Then Jonas's voice, young and slightly startled. Yes, ma'am. How'd you know it was us? Tully walks like a man who spent 20 years on hard floors, she said. You walk like someone who's still deciding whether the ground belongs to him. She turned then with 2 cups of coffee already poured. Sit down. We have work to plan before the others wake up. They sat. Tully wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at her across the table with those watchful, careful eyes. Jonas held his cup like it might say something he wasn't ready to hear. The smokehouse door, she said to Tully. You said this morning. First light, he confirmed. I pulled the hinge pins last night and soaked them in oil. Should loosen without breaking. The frame's still true. It just swelled from years of moisture getting in. Once I get the door aligned and hung proper, it'll seal right. Good. She looked at Jonas. What do you know about salt curing? He sat up slightly. My father used a dry rub salt and sugar mostly, sometimes a little pepper. He'd let the ham set in it for 2 weeks before smoking. Did he use saltpeter? Sometimes, for the big cuts. He said it kept the color and held back spoilage longer. He was right, she said. We'll be doing extended cures here, not just for immediate use, but for storage and for sale. That means the ratios need to be exact. Too much saltpeter and the meat tastes of metal. Too little and it won't hold through the winter. Your father taught you well enough to measure by feel, or do you need written ratios? Jonas's jaw tightened slightly. Not offense, but the particular pride of a young man who wants to prove himself and isn't sure yet if he's earned the room to do it. I can measure, he said. I just need to know what you're aiming for. A 12-day cure on the primary cuts, she said. Then a controlled smoke at low heat for no less than 8 hours. After that, a rest period before wrapping. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A page from her father's ledger, the handwriting dense and precise, the margins filled with notes in a smaller hand that was her own. Everything is here. Ratios, timing, wood quantities. I need you to learn this the way you know your own name. Because when we have more than one batch running, I'll need you managing the cure without me standing over your shoulder. Jonas looked down at the paper. His hands opened and closed once around his coffee cup. Then he reached out and took it carefully, like it was something that might be taken back if he moved too fast. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. Tully was watching Margaret with an expression that had moved overnight from cautious assessment to something closer to quiet alignment. "What about the wood?" he asked. "You mentioned hickory." "Oak will do," she said. "I need you to check what's in the woodpile behind the grain shed. If there's not enough hardwood, I need to know, before we fire the box, not after. Green wood will ruin everything it produces. The wrong smoke, too much moisture bitterness in the meat." She paused. "And Tully, what you find in that woodpile, I need the truth of it. Not what you think I want to hear. The truth." He looked at her steadily. "You'll get the truth," he said. "I don't have the energy for anything else." She nodded. That was enough. They finished their coffee in the particular comfortable silence of people who are already thinking through what needs to happen next. Outside, the light was coming up properly now. Pale gold washing across the frost on the window glass, and from the bunkhouse came the first sounds of men waking boots hitting floors, low voices coughing. Margaret stood. She moved back to the stove and began pulling together breakfast, more of the cornmeal mush from last night's portion. The last of the salt pork cut thin and rendered until it was mostly cracklings. A small pan of flat cornbread, baked hard and honest in the cast iron. It wasn't a generous meal, but it was precise. Every portion calculated. Nothing wasted, nothing excessive. When Garrett came through the door first, because he always seemed to position himself to be first at everything, as though a rival order determined authority, he stopped and looked at the table and then at her. "Same as yesterday," he said. "Smaller than yesterday," she said without apology. "We're 3 days from the first supply delivery, and I'm managing what we have to make it reach. Eat what's in front of you or don't, but there's no other portion." Garrett's eyes moved across her face, looking for something he could use. Weakness, uncertainty, apology. The particular flinch that told him he'd found the edge of what she could hold. He found nothing. He sat down and ate. The other men filed in around him, taking their portions with the specific quiet of men who had been hungry long enough that food, even modest food, silenced them. Margaret moved through the room efficiently, refilling the water pitcher, noting who was moving slowly, who looked hollow-eyed, who was eating carefully, because their teeth were bad. The kind of information you collect not because anyone tells you to, but because you're paying attention, and attention is the beginning of every solution. Harlan came in last. He stood at the far end of the table and looked at the meal, and then at his men, and then briefly at Margaret. "This is breakfast," he said. It wasn't quite a question, and it wasn't quite a complaint. "For now," she said. "By the end of the week, the situation improves." "You're confident about that." "I'm accurate about that," she said. "There's a difference." A few of the men glanced between them. Garrett's spoon paused slightly between bowl and mouth. Harlan pulled out his chair and sat down without another word. It was not a capitulation. Not yet. But it was the recognition that this was not a battle he could win before breakfast on a cold Tuesday morning. Tully and Jonas slipped out before the meal was finished, and Margaret watched them go through the kitchen window, Tully heading straight for the woodpile, Jonas moving toward the smokehouse, with the purposeful stride of someone who has been given something meaningful to do and doesn't intend to waste it. She felt something settle in her chest. Not satisfaction, it was too early for satisfaction, but momentum. The particular feeling of gears beginning to turn. The woodpile report came back within the hour. Tully found her in the kitchen, his cap in his hands, his expression carrying the careful neutrality of a man about to deliver mixed news to someone who asked for the truth. "Enough oak for 2 batches, he said. "Maybe 3 if we're careful with the burn rate. There's a stand of downed timber about a mile east on the property line. Looks like it's been there a few seasons, so it's dry enough. I can get a crew out there tomorrow and have it cut and hauled back by evening." "How many men would you need?" 4, maybe 5. Men who can swing an axe and aren't too proud to haul wood. "Can you get them without going through Harlan first?" Tully paused. "Some of them, yes. Garrett's crew won't move without his say-so. But there are 6 or 7 of the younger men who'll take direction from whoever's giving it. Margaret nodded slowly. I'll speak to Harlan about it at midday. I want the woodcutting arranged as ranch business, not as a favor to me. If the men see it as Harlan's decision, they'll follow through. If they see it as mine, half of them will find reasons to be busy elsewhere. Tully's mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile. You understand men pretty well for someone who just got here. I understand hungry, proud people, she said. Men are a common variety of that. He put his cap back on and turned for the door and then stopped. Miss Doyle, he said. Margaret, she said. He turned back. Margaret, the smokehouse door is hung and sealed. Interior's been swept. Jonas is in there now checking the hanging racks. He paused one more beat. That boy's going to do well if someone points him right. I know, she said. That's why I pointed him. Harlan found her in the smokehouse that afternoon. She was inside with Jonas going through the hanging mechanics of the upper rack. One of the hooks had pulled slightly from the beam, not enough to be dangerous yet, but enough to fail under weight if they didn't address it before loading. Harlan ducked through the low doorway and stood just inside it, his hat in his hand, his eyes moving across the interior with an expression that Margaret could not quite read, something between recognition and pain. The look of someone standing in a place that once meant something and is now asking to mean something again. My father built those hooks himself, he said. Forged them from bar iron. I know, she said. The construction is too precise to be store-bought. The shape of the curve tells you how much thought went into it. Someone who understood how weight distributes under smoke heat. She glanced at him. He was a careful man. Harlan was quiet for a moment. He was, he said at last. And then, with the specific difficulty of a proud man offering something real, he would have known what to do here. I don't always. Margaret didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it sit the way her father had taught her to let silence sit when someone was using it to say something true. You knew to send for help, she said finally. That's not nothing. Harlan looked at her. The woodcutting, she said, moving them back to ground that felt safer for both of them. I need a crew out at that downed timber stand tomorrow. 5 men a full day. Tully knows where it is. I'll assign it, he said. Assign it as ranch business, she said. Don't frame it as being for the smokehouse. Not yet. Let the men think they're just doing regular work. He frowned slightly. Why? Because right now, half your crew is watching me to see if I fail, she said plainly. If I make them do work for my project before I've given them a reason to believe in it, they'll resent the work before it produces anything. Let them cut the wood as ranch labor. When the first batch comes out of this smokehouse and they smell what it is, the work will already be done, and they'll have been part of it without having had to decide to be. Harlan stared at her. Jonas on the ladder above them was very carefully making himself invisible. That's, Harlan started, stopped, started again. That is a more strategic way of thinking about it than I expected. You expected a cook, she said. Yes, he said honestly. I know, she said. I expect you'll adjust. That night, Garrett came to the kitchen, not at a mealtime. Late after the bunkhouse had gone quiet, after the last lamp in the main house had been turned down. Margaret was still at the kitchen table, her father's ledger open in front of her, calculating cure quantities against the projected weight of the first batch. She heard his boots on the back step and didn't look up. He knocked twice, which surprised her. She hadn't expected him to knock. Come in, she said. He came in and stood just inside the door, his hat in his hands, that gesture that men make with their hats when they're doing something their pride is uncomfortable with. He was a tall man with a lean, weathered face and eyes that had spent too many years squinting into distance to fully open indoors anymore. You're up late, he said. I'm working, she said. Same as you should be sleeping. He turned his hat once around in his hands. What you said this morning, about the portions, what about it? You meant it. I always mean what I say, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, How bad is it, the food situation? The real number. At breakfast, stripped of the posturing, the performance of authority, he ran for the benefit of the other men. This was a man who understood responsibility, whether he liked it or not, asking a real question. She considered him for a moment. Then she turned the ledger toward him and put her finger on the line that showed current supplies against projected daily consumption. He leaned over and looked at it. She watched his face absorb what the numbers said. 9 days, he said. At current consumption, yes. That's why the portions were reduced this morning. I've bought us 11 days with the reduction. Enough time for the first cure to begin and for the supply delivery to arrive. You're counting on the delivery coming through. I'm planning on the delivery coming through, she said. If it doesn't, we adjust again, but we do not stop moving forward. She pulled the ledger back. Garrett. He looked at her. I'm not your enemy, she said. And I'm not an obstacle. I'm the reason this ranch is still going to be operating in 3 months. You can spend that time making it harder for me to do my job, or you can spend it being part of why it works. That's your choice. But I need you to make it soon, because I don't have the time or the patience to spend on a man who hasn't decided yet. The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable, and entirely his. He put his hat back on. The men I bunk with, he said finally, they're good workers. They've been here long enough to deserve better than what they've been getting. I know that, she said. You keep your end of this food on the table, regular portions, something that looks like a future, and you won't have trouble from me. I'll keep my end, she said. I always do. He nodded once, short and certain, and went back out through the door. Margaret sat for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to her calculations. 4 days later, the first cure went in. It wasn't a large batch, 2 sides of pork from a hog that Harlan had been holding back a quantity of beef brisket from a steer that had injured a leg and needed to be put down, and 3 whole chickens that would smoke faster than the larger cuts and give them a result to taste inside the week. Margaret worked the cure herself with Jonas beside her, moving through the ratios with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this so many times that the measurement lives in her hands rather than her head. Jonas watched everything and asked questions that were good questions, specific, technical, aimed at understanding rather than just following instruction. Why do we pack it tighter on the edges? He asked. Because the edges are where air gets in, she said. Air is where bacteria lives. You pack tight, you reduce the surface exposure, you extend the preservation window by days. Your father taught you all this. My father taught me that food is power, she said. Everything else is just technique. Jonas was quiet for a moment, working the cure into a cut of brisket with careful, even strokes. My father used to say that a man who could feed people would never go hungry himself. Your father was right, she said. So was mine. The smokehouse door closed on the first batch at mid-morning. Tully had built the fire precise and low in the pit, feeding it with the oak from the downed timber stand, dry and clean, burning with the kind of steady, patient heat that produces good smoke rather than frantic smoke. The smell that came from the smokehouse that afternoon was something that hadn't existed on this ranch in 5 years. Men who had been working in the far corral stopped without knowing why. Men in the barn lifted their heads. Even Garrett, who was repairing fence line near the grain shed with 2 of his crew, straightened up and stood still for a moment. Nobody said anything. But the quality of the silence changed. Harlan came to find her that evening. She was at the smokehouse checking the temperature, using a method her father had shown her, passing her hand through the upper vent and feeling the air coming out, reading its heat the way you read a face for emotion. It's working, he said. He wasn't asking. He could smell it. It's starting, she said. Working comes in 12 days when we pull the first batch. He stood beside her in the evening cooling air, and she could feel him trying to find the words for something he wasn't accustomed to putting into words. I owe you an apology, he said. The words came out the way they do from men who don't apologize, often slightly too careful, slightly too formal, like something rehearsed but not often practiced. For what specifically, she said. For what I said when you arrived, that you were smaller than I expected." He paused. "It was a poor thing to say." "It was an honest thing," she said. "You were cataloging whether I could do the job." Still, she looked at him sideways. "Mr. Harlan, I have been underestimated in every room I've ever walked into. I stopped being bothered by it somewhere around my 22nd year, when I realized that being underestimated means people are never watching when you actually do the work." She turned back to the vent. "I prefer it if I'm honest." He was quiet for a moment. "That's an unusual way to see it," he said. "It's an accurate way," she said. "Now go inside. It's cold, and you standing out here second-guessing yourself isn't helping either of us." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He went inside. The supply delivery arrived on day 6, 2 days early, which was unexpected and welcome. A wagon from the Territorial Provisioners Company came through with a load that included additional salt sugar. The saltpeter she'd requested a quantity of dried beans and cornmeal, and because she had added it to the order with precise reasoning, in the attached letter. A small crate of hardwood chips in 4 varieties: hickory, cherry apple, and mesquite. The driver handed her the manifest to sign, and then handed her a second sheet. She looked at it. It was a query from the provisioner's office, handwritten, which meant someone had taken it seriously enough not to have a clerk type it. "Regarding your Smokehouse revival, we have 3 supply contracts, currently unfilled in this territory, for cured pork and beef. If product meets standard, we are interested in discussing terms. Please advise." Margaret read it twice. She folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket. She signed the manifest and helped the driver unload, and she did not say anything to Harlan about the letter until that evening, when dinner was done and the men had dispersed and the kitchen was quiet. She put the letter on the table in front of him. He read it. His face didn't move much, but she watched the precise moment when the meaning of it arrived. Not just the words, but what the words meant for the future of this ranch. The color shifted slightly at the base of his jaw. His breathing changed just barely. "They want to contract with us," he said. "They want to contract with the Smokehouse," she said. He looked up. "That distinction matters," she said quietly. "Because those contracts will be won or lost on the consistency and quality of what comes out of that building. Not on the cattle, not on the land. On the work I'm doing and the standards I hold." She paused. "I need you to understand that before we discuss whether to respond to them." "You want credit," he said, not harshly, just reading the situation. "I want structure," she said. "If we enter into supply contracts, I need decision-making authority over everything that goes through that smokehouse. Quantities, curing times, product standards, pricing. I cannot deliver consistent product if someone above me can override the process, because the immediate cash looks more appealing than the long-term quality." Harlan looked at her for a long time. This was the conversation she knew. Not the one they'd had in the smokehouse, not the one about woodcutting or morning portions. This was the one that would determine what the next year of this ranch looked like, what the next decade looked like. "What are you asking for exactly?" he said. "I'm asking for a formal agreement," she said. "In writing. That the smokehouse operation falls under my authority. That you don't override my production decisions. That if these contracts come through, the income is allocated with a portion going to reinvestment in the operation, wood supplies, curing materials before anything is counted as profit." "And what do you get out of it?" he said. "Beyond a wage." She had thought about this. She had thought about it for 4 days, measuring it against what she knew about pride, and what she knew about men, and what she knew about what happened to women who did exceptional work without attaching their name to it. "A percentage of the smokehouse revenue," she said. 10%. Against the day that this operation is large enough, that 10% is significant. Harlan set the letter down. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind had come up again, that long, cold sweep across the prairie that made the house settle and creak, made the fire in the stove tick and pop. "You're not what I sent for," he said. "No," she agreed. "I'm not." 10%, he said. 10%, she said. He picked up his pen, and he wrote it down. He wrote it down. 2 lines. His handwriting was heavy and deliberate, the kind that comes from a man who learned to write late and has never trusted it entirely. But the words were clear, and the ink was dark, and when he pushed the paper across the table to her, Margaret read it twice before she folded it and put it in the same pocket as the provisioner's letter. She didn't thank him. She didn't need to. The agreement existed. That was enough. What she didn't tell him, what she would not tell him until the time was right, was that she had already written back to the provisioner's office that afternoon before dinner, before she had put the letter in front of Harlan at all. She had written back in careful professional language outlining the Smokehouse's current capacity, the curing timeline, the expected first delivery date, and the quality standards she intended to maintain. She had signed it with her own name, not Harlan's, hers. She had done this not to deceive him, but because she understood something that William Harlan, for all his pride and stubbornness, had not yet learned in business. The person who establishes the relationship owns the relationship. And she intended to own this one. The first batch came out of the smokehouse on a Wednesday, 12 days after it went in exactly as she had planned. Jonas had managed the final smoke cycle himself, with Tully monitoring the fire, a thing Margaret had arranged deliberately, because she needed them to have done this without her standing over them. Before the contract's required volume, she couldn't manage alone. She pulled the first cut herself. A side of pork cured and smoked and rested to the correct internal color, the surface carrying that deep mahogany gloss that her father had told her was the mark of patience, that you couldn't rush smoke any more than you could rush trust, and the product always told you whether you'd tried. She cut a thin slice and tasted it before she let anyone else near it, closed her eyes, opened them. "Jonas," she said. He was watching her from 2 feet away, with the focused intensity of a student waiting for a grade that matters. "Taste this," she said. He took the slice she offered, put it in his mouth, chewed once, twice. His face went through 3 expressions in quick succession: assessment, recognition, then something quieter and more personal, the look of a person who has been reminded of something good from a long time ago. "That's right," he said softly. "That's right," she agreed. She cut 3 more slices, one for Tully, who tasted it and nodded once slowly with his eyes down, the way men nod when they don't want you to see that something has moved them. One she set aside for Harlan, wrapped in cloth, placed on the kitchen table, where he would find it when he came in from the afternoon's work. The third slice she carried to the bunkhouse herself. She pushed the door open and walked in, and 12 men looked up from what they were doing, mending sleeping cleaning tack with the particular alertness that comes from the unexpected. Garrett was at the far end, sitting on his bunk with a bridle across his knees. She walked to the center of the room and set the platter on the table there. 3 slices of pork, thin cut, properly rested, still faintly warm from the smokehouse. Nobody moved. "Go ahead," she said. It was Garrett who stood first. He crossed the room and looked down at the meat, and then picked up a slice and ate it, standing there, not sitting the way he did, everything upright in full view, unwilling to let the act of eating look like submission. His jaw moved. His eyes changed. He said nothing, but he turned to the man nearest him, a quiet hand named Prescott, who had barely spoken 10 words since Margaret arrived, and said, "Go ahead," in a tone that made it an instruction rather than a suggestion. Within 30 seconds, the platter was empty. Margaret picked it up and walked back toward the door. "Miss Doyle," Garrett said. She stopped. "When's the next batch ready?" She looked back at him. 10 days, she said. "If you and your crew bring in the second woodload by Friday." A pause, a decision being made behind his eyes that he was too proud to show on his face. "Friday," he said. "Consider it done." She left without another word. The news from the provisioner's office came back faster than she had expected, which told her the contracts they'd mentioned were genuine, not speculative. A rider arrived 4 days after she'd sent her letter, carrying a formal response on the company's letterhead. They wanted a tasting visit, not a letter exchange, not a price negotiation conducted by telegraph. A representative from the provisioner's office, a man named Gerald Hatch, would ride out to the ranch within the fortnight to inspect the product, review the operation, and if everything met standard, discuss contract terms on site. Margaret read the letter standing in the yard. Then she went to find Harlan. He was in the barn, which was where he went when something was bothering him, and he didn't want anyone to see it bothering him. She had learned this about him in 3 weeks. He was a man who processed difficulty through physical work and proximity to animals, which was not the worst way she'd encountered. "Hatch is coming," she said. He looked up from the stall he was cleaning. "Gerald Hatch. You know him." "I know of him," Harlan said. He set down his fork and turned to face her fully. "Gerald Hatch is not just a company representative, Margaret. He is the territorial provisioner's head buyer. If he's coming personally, it means they want this contract more than they let on in the letter." She absorbed this. "What do you know about him?" she said. "Precise man, hard to impress. He has a reputation for walking away from deals if anything about the operation feels sloppy or unreliable." Harlan paused. "He also has a reputation for negotiating down the price on anything he suspects the seller needs more than he does." "He won't negotiate down," Margaret said. Harlan tilted his head slightly. "How can you be sure?" "Because I won't let him," she said. "I know what our product is worth. I know what the unfilled contracts in this territory mean for his quarterly numbers. And I know that a man who rides out personally to see an operation is a man who has already decided he wants it. He's just come to confirm the wanting." She looked at him steadily. "I need 2 things from you before he arrives." "Name them." "I need the smokehouse yard cleaned and the exterior repaired, nothing elaborate, just functional and deliberate. A visitor reads the outside of a building before he walks into it, and the outside tells him what kind of operation he's dealing with." She paused. "And I need you to let me lead the meeting." Harlan was very still for a moment. "It's my ranch," he said. "It is," she agreed. "And these are your walls, and your land, and your name on the deed. None of that is in question. But the contracts are for the smokehouse, and the smokehouse is mine to operate. If Hatch sits across a table and sees a man trying to represent an operation he doesn't fully understand, he'll use that gap." She held Harlan's gaze. "Let me represent what I know. You represent everything else. We come out of that meeting with a contract that works for both of us." The silence between them held everything that had accumulated over 3 weeks, every argument and adjustment and reluctant concession and quiet moment at the smokehouse door. All of it sitting in the 4 feet of barn air between them. "All right," Harlan said. "Thank you," she said. And she meant it not as a courtesy, but as a genuine acknowledgement of what it cost him. She was 3 steps out of the barn when his voice stopped her. "Margaret." She turned. "The percentage agreement," he said. "I want you to know I intend to honor it regardless of what Hatch offers. The 10% stands whether the contracts are large or small." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "I put it in writing because it was right to, not because I doubted you." And this time, he almost smiled all the way. The 2 weeks before Hatch's arrival were the hardest working 2 weeks the Harlan Ranch had seen in years. Not because Margaret drove the men. She didn't have to. Something had shifted in the bunkhouse after the tasting, something that had no official name and that no one discussed directly, but that expressed itself in the way men moved through their days. With more purpose, with fewer complaints, with the particular energy that comes from people who have been given a reason to care about the outcome of their own labor. Garrett organized the exterior repairs himself without being asked. He pulled 3 of his crew and put them on the smokehouse yard, clearing the scrub brush, rehanging the gate, repairing the split-rail fence that ran along the back property line. He did this on a Tuesday morning, and when Margaret came out and saw what was happening, she stopped and watched for a moment. Then she went and found Garrett. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "No." He agreed. He didn't look up from the fence rail he was setting. "But the man coming out here is going to look at every loose board and every weed, and he's going to make a decision about what we're worth. I'd rather he made that decision based on actual evidence." He paused. "My father used to say that if your yard told people you didn't care, they'd believe you about everything else too." "Smart man," she said. He had his moments, Garrett said. Jonas had the second bugging everything in the notebook Margaret had given him, coming to her only when something was genuinely uncertain, rather than when he was nervous and wanted reassurance. This too was progress, not just competence growing, but confidence growing alongside it. The only problem arrived on the Thursday before Hatch was due. It arrived in the form of a man named Colbert. Colbert was one of Harlan's oldest hands, not old in years, maybe 55, but old in the way certain men get when they have decided that their way of doing things is correct and have spent decades defending that position. He had been in the years before Margaret arrived the de facto authority on food management, not because he knew much about food, but because he was the one who distributed the salt pork and tracked the supplies and kept the key to the grain shed. He had lost that role the day Margaret arrived and had never said one word about it. The silence of it had been too long and too complete. She found out about the problem when Jonas came to her on that Thursday morning with his notebook clutched against his chest and an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not uncertainty, not nerves, but the specific look of someone who has discovered something wrong and is working out the right way to say it. "What is it?" she said immediately. "The second batch," he said. "I did the daily check this morning. The brisket cures on the lower rack are off." She went cold. Not in fear, in focus. The two things felt similar, but they were not the same. "Off how?" she said. "The salt pack is disturbed on 4 of the cuts. Not from settling from contact. Someone moved them." She stared at him. "Moved them," she repeated. "Repacked them wrong. The edges are exposed." He held the notebook toward her, the page open to that morning's log, his handwriting precise and careful. She had insisted on precision in his records, and he had delivered it, which was now the thing that proved the damage was real. If they cure wrong, the product will be compromised. Maybe unsafe. Margaret looked at the log for 5 seconds. Then she looked up. "When did you last check them?" "Yesterday evening, 6 o'clock. Everything was right." "Then it happened overnight." "Yes." She walked to the smokehouse. The door was not locked. She had not locked it because she had believed that the operation had earned enough respect from the men to not require a lock. She walked inside and went directly to the lower rack and looked at the 4 cuts Jonas had flagged. He was right. Someone had moved them. Not vandalism, not the wild disturbance of someone trying to destroy something. The careful, deliberate repacking of someone who thought they knew better or who wanted to introduce just enough irregularity to create doubt about the quality of the product. She stood in the smokehouse for 2 full minutes. Then she walked to the main house and knocked on Harlan's study door. "Come in," he said. She came in and closed the door behind her. She didn't sit. "Someone interfered with the second batch last night," she said. 4 cuts on the lower rack disturbed overnight. Jonas caught it on the morning check. Harlan's face went through several things in quick succession. "Who?" "I don't know yet," she said. But whoever it was had a key or the smokehouse door was already accessible. Either way, it was deliberate. "Deliberate," he repeated. The word landed between them with weight. "The product can be saved," she said. "I can repack the cuts today and extend the cure time by 3 days to compensate. The batch will still be ready before Hatch arrives, but only if I start now." She paused. "But I need you to understand what I'm telling you, Mr. Harlan. Someone on this property doesn't want that meeting to go well." Harlan stood up from his desk. "I'll find out who," he said. "I know you will," she said. "But quietly and after I've fixed the batch. If word spreads through the bunkhouse that there's an investigation, the men will spend the next 10 days watching each other instead of working, and Hatch will arrive to find a crew that's fractured and suspicious." She looked at him with complete steadiness. "Fix the product first. Find the person second. In that order." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're right," he said. And she could see how much it cost him not to agree with her, but to stand still while something had been done against his ranch and against his authority, and not go out immediately and solve it with confrontation. "Thank you," she said, and went back to the smokehouse. She worked for 4 hours repairing the damage with Jonas beside her, and the smokehouse door closed against anyone who might come to observe. She repacked each cut with the precision her father had taught her, working by feel, and by the smell of the cure, the particular chemical conversation between salt and fat and sugar that told you, if you knew how to listen, what was happening inside the meat. "Will it be all right?" Jonas asked quietly. "Yes," she said, "because we caught it early enough. If you hadn't been precise in your logging, if you'd rounded your observations instead of recording exactly what you saw, we might not have known until we pulled the batch." She looked at him. "This is why I asked for precision." He was quiet for a moment, his hands working steadily alongside hers. Then, "Who do you think did it?" She considered how much to say. "I have an idea," she said, "but I won't say it out loud until I'm certain. Suspicion spoken before it's proven is just gossip, and gossip costs more than it's worth." Jonas nodded. He understood that. She found out for certain that evening, not through investigation, but through the particular stupidity of a guilty man who couldn't stay completely quiet about his own guilt. At supper, Colbert made a remark ostensibly to the man sitting next to him, but calibrated to carry to Margaret's end of the table about how some new operations have a way of looking better than they turn out to be. It was not a confession, but it was close enough. She looked at him across the table. He met her gaze for exactly 1 second before his eyes moved away. That told her everything. After supper, she went to Harlan's study. "Colbert," she said. Harlan's face didn't show surprise. "You're sure?" "Sure enough," she said. "He won't do it again, he knows I know, and that's enough to stop him. But I need you to reassign him, not fire him, which would cause more disruption than it's worth. Reassign him to something that keeps him away from the smokehouse." She paused. "And I'd like the smokehouse to have a lock from today forward. A good one." "Done," Harlan said. "Both of them," she said. "Tonight." "Both of them," he agreed. By the time Gerald Hatch rode up to the Harlan ranch on a clean, sharp morning 11 days later, the second batch was hanging finished and perfect. In the smokehouse, the yard was ordered and deliberate, the fence line was repaired, and 22 men went about their work with the focused, purposeful energy of a crew that had something to be proud of. Hatch was not what Margaret expected. She had built a picture of him from Harlan's description: precise, hard, implacable. And the man who dismounted in the yard carried all of those qualities. But he was younger than she'd imagined, maybe 40, with a quick assessing gaze that moved across the yard and the buildings and the men, and finally landed on her with the same calculating attentiveness he'd given everything else. He looked at her the way men in his position always looked at her, taking stock, recalibrating, deciding whether to take her seriously. She waited. He walked toward her and extended his hand. "Miss Doyle, Gerald Hatch." She shook it. Her grip was firm. His was too. "Mr. Hatch, thank you for coming." She turned slightly. "Mr. Harlan, whom you may know by reputation." Harlan stepped forward. They shook hands with the careful cordiality of men who have each heard of the other and are deciding what to make of the in-person version. "Let's start with the product," Margaret said, not a question, a direction. She took Hatch through the smokehouse. He was precise as advertised. He touched, smelled, examined. Asked specific and technical questions about cure ratios and smoke temperature and storage method. Margaret answered every question without consulting notes, without hesitation, without the particular verbal hedging that happens when a person is answering from memory rather than knowledge. She answered because she knew. Because this was the thing she had spent her life learning, and the thing she had spent the last 3 weeks executing. Hatch pulled a thin slice from the first batch himself, using the knife she offered, and tasted it with the focused attention of a man who does this professionally, and knows what excellence tastes like, and knows also what mediocrity that has been dressed up to look like excellence tastes like. He chewed, set the knife down, looked at her. "This is exceptional," he said, not enthusiastic, not performatively impressed, Just flat, honest professional assessment. Yes, she said. It is. Something shifted in his expression. Not offense at her directness. Something closer to respect for it. The contracts I mentioned in my letter, he said. I understated the situation somewhat. Margaret waited. We have 5 unfilled contracts in this territory, Hatch said. Not 3. 5. 2 of our previous suppliers failed to deliver to standard this past season, and we terminated those relationships. The contracts are significant quarterly volume fixed pricing with annual adjustment 6-month minimum commitment per contract. He looked at her steadily. Can this operation fill 5 contracts? Margaret did not answer immediately. This was the moment she had understood was coming. Had understood from the day she wrote back to his office if she were honest with herself. This was the question that everything had been building toward, and the answer required her to be accurate rather than ambitious, because one oversold contract that couldn't be filled would cost more than 5 conservative ones that could. Currently, no, she said. Hatch raised an eyebrow. Currently, I can fill 2 contracts consistently and to standard, she continued. If I expand the smokehouse operation a second fire pit, additional hanging capacity, 2 more trained workers, I can fill 4 within 6 months, 5 by end of year. She looked at him without blinking. I will not promise you volume I cannot deliver at the quality you just tasted. That product is what you're buying. I will not compromise it for quantity. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Hatch looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at Margaret. Then Hatch said, 2 contracts now with a formal review at 60 days for expansion. With pricing set now for all 5, Margaret said, so that when we expand, the rate doesn't change. Hatch stared at her. She held it. That's, he started. That's fair, she said. You get protected supply at consistent quality. We get protected pricing as we scale. Neither of us takes a risk we don't understand. Another silence. Then Gerald Hatch did something she would remember for the rest of her life. He smiled. Not much. Just enough. Miss Doyle, he said, I have negotiated contracts with ranchers and provisioners across 4 territories for 11 years. He paused. You are the sharpest person I have sat across a table from in at least 3 of them. I'll take that as a yes on the pricing, she said. Yes, he said, on the pricing. They sat down at the kitchen table. Hatch, Harlan, and Margaret, and the papers came out, and the terms were written, and it was Margaret's hand that drafted the language of the smokehouse clauses, because Harlan had looked at her across the table and given her the smallest nod, which was the biggest thing he had given her yet. She wrote it out in her clean, precise hand. Quality standards as established by M. Doyle. Production oversight. M. Doyle. Contract signatory. Harlan Ranch W. Harlan and M. Doyle jointly. She wrote that last line and looked up at Harlan. He looked at it. He looked at her. He picked up the pen and signed his name. She signed hers beside it. Hatch witnessed it and signed below. And when the ink was dry, he looked at the 2 names sitting side by side on the contract, and something passed across his face that was not quite an expression, but was the shape of a thought, the recognition of something that didn't often happen, and that when it did, tended to mean something lasting. He folded his copy carefully. I'll expect the first delivery in 30 days, he said. You'll have it, Margaret said. He rode out an hour later, and the yard was quiet again, and the October light was going long and golden across the frost-bitten grass, and William Harlan stood beside Margaret in the yard, watching the dust settle behind Hatch's horse. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Harlan said quietly, You put both our names on the contract. I did, she said, before I agreed to it. Yes. A pause. I would have agreed, he said. I know, she said, but I didn't want to wait for the asking. The wind came across the yard cold and certain. Harlan turned his hat in his hands, that gesture she had seen him make when something was working through him that hadn't resolved yet. Margaret, he said. She waited. This ranch is going to survive, he said, and the way he said it was not triumphant. It was the quiet, almost disbelieving exhale of a man who has been drowning for a very long time and has just felt solid ground under his feet for the first time in years. It's actually going to survive. She looked out at the smokehouse, at the ordered yard, at the repaired fence line, at Jonas crossing toward the grain shed with purpose in every step. "Yes," she said, "it is." She said it as a fact, because it was one. And somewhere in the understanding between them, between this hard, proud, debt-burdened man and the woman he had sent for to save him, and who had done exactly that, and more. Something that had no name yet, but that both of them felt the edges of began to take a shape that neither of them was quite ready to look at directly. Not yet. The smokehouse door stood open behind them, breathing out the long, slow, patient smell of smoke and salt, and something that might in another season be called a future. The 30 days moved fast. Not the way easy days move fast, the way days move when every single one of them is full to the edge with work that matters, and decisions that have consequences, and the particular exhaustion that comes from building something real out of something broken. Margaret felt it in her hands first, the way she always did, a deep ache in the joints from the cold and the constant work, the kind of ache her father had carried his whole life without complaint, and that she had inherited along with his ledgers and his patience and his understanding that nothing worth having came without the physical evidence of effort. The first delivery went out on time. Jonas drove the wagon himself with Tully riding alongside the product packed in the precise layering system Margaret had developed, wrapped cuts separated by clean cloth stacked by weight distribution, so the bottom layer didn't compress the top, the whole load covered with oilskin against the weather. She had written the delivery manifest herself, listing each cut by weight and cure duration and smoke variety, because she understood that the manifest was not just a record, it was a statement of standards, and statements of standards were how you told a buyer that you took your own work seriously. Hatch's receiving man signed for it without complaint. 3 days later, a note arrived from the provisioner's office. 2 words, product satisfactory. Margaret read it at the kitchen table and set it down and went back to work. Harlan found it there that evening and picked it up and read it and looked at her across the kitchen. "Satisfactory," he said. From Hatch's office, satisfactory means exceptional, she said without looking up from the inventory she was compiling. If there had been any issue at all, the word would have been different. "How do you know that?" "Because I asked him directly when he was here," she said. "I asked him what language his office uses for different quality assessments. He told me. Satisfactory is their highest unmarked rating. It means no adjustments required, no complaints anticipated, full contract continuation." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "You asked him for their rating language," he said slowly. "I asked him everything I needed to know," she said. "I always do." He set the note back on the table. She could feel him standing there working something through, and she waited because she had learned that Harlan processed things at his own pace, and pressuring that pace only made him retreat. "The expansion," he said at last. "The second fire pit. You said 6 months. I said I could fill 4 contracts within 6 months with the expansion," she said, "which means I need to begin the expansion now if that timeline is to hold. What does it cost?" She turned the inventory ledger toward him and pointed to the column she had already calculated. She had done it 3 days ago. He looked at it, and she watched his face do the arithmetic against what was in the ranch's account, which she knew, because he had shown her the ledger 2 weeks ago, not because she'd asked, but because he'd brought it to her, placed it on the table beside her own, and said simply, "You should know all of it." That had been the real shift between them. Not the contract, not the joint signature. The moment he placed the full financial picture in front of her without being asked, because he had accepted that she needed to see it to do her job, and that her doing her job was now inseparable from whether this ranch survived. "We can cover it," he said. "Barely, but we can. We can cover the construction," she said. "The additional labor is different. I need 2 more trained workers in the smokehouse. I can train them myself, but I need men who have the patience for precise work. Not all of your crew does." "Who do you want?" "Prescott," she said immediately. "He watches everything and says nothing, which means he's thinking constantly. That's the kind of mind that does well with the cure process. I want someone with actual butchery experience if we can find it. Someone from the territory who knows meat structure. Harlan nodded slowly. I'll ask around at the next supply run. I already asked Cobb, she said. He runs supply to 6 ranches. He knows everyone. He said there's a man in Redfield who worked in a commercial smokehouse in Chicago before he came west, lost his position when the operation closed. He's been doing odd ranch work for 8 months. Harlan stared at her. You asked Cobb, he said. Last Tuesday when he made the regular supply drop, she said. Without telling me. She looked at him then directly and without apology. I'm telling you now. I'm asking your permission to offer the man a position. That's the order of operations I find you approve we hire. That's how it works between us. A silence. Then something crossed Harlan's face that wasn't quite frustration anymore. It was something more complicated, the specific expression of a man who is realizing repeatedly and in new ways each time that the person across from him is always 3 steps ahead, and that this is in fact exactly what he needed. Offer him the position, he said. I already sent word with Cobb, she said. He'll arrive Friday if he's interested. Harlan opened his mouth, closed it. Margaret, he said. William, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. They both noticed it. Neither of them mentioned it. You are the most aggravating woman I have ever met, he said. I know, she said. And your ranch is going to survive because of it. Now sit down. I need to show you the 60-day expansion plan. And I need you to understand all of it, not just the numbers. He sat down. His name was Daniel Marsh, the man from Redfield, and he arrived on Friday as Cobb had said he might. A quiet, compact man in his late 30s with the particular economy of movement that comes from years of physical work done in tight spaces. He shook Margaret's hand in the yard and looked her in the eye with the direct professional attention of someone who has been in the trade long enough to recognize another tradesperson on site. You ran a commercial smokehouse, she said. Floor supervisor, he said. 30-man operation in the south side. Hogs mostly. Some beef. We did volume work, not the kind of precision cure you're describing in your letter, but I understand the principles and I learn fast. Precision cure is different from volume work, she said. Yes, he said. That's why I want to learn it. She liked that answer. She hired him that afternoon. The next 6 weeks were the most productive the Harlan Ranch had seen in a decade. The second fire pit went in during the second week of November. Tully supervising the construction with the same precise care he gave to everything the stonework solid and the airflow design copied from the original pit, with 2 modifications Margaret had specified, based on what she'd observed in the first pit's behavior. The expansion doubled the smokehouse's hanging capacity and allowed for overlapping cure cycles, which meant continuous production, rather than the start and stop rhythm of a single batch operation. Marsh learned faster than she'd expected, which told her his self-assessment had been accurate, and his honesty about his own gaps had been genuine. 2 qualities she valued above almost everything else in a worker. Within 3 weeks, he was managing the overnight temperature monitoring a job that required waking twice in the night to check the fire and adjust the draft, which most men resisted. He didn't resist. He simply did it. Prescott turned out to be exactly what she had expected from a man who watched everything. A worker of extraordinary patience and precision, who kept his cure logs in handwriting so neat it looked typeset, and who asked questions that revealed he had already thought 3 steps past the answer before he asked it. The bunkhouse had changed. This was the thing Margaret noticed most clearly in the 45th day. Not the production numbers, not the expanding inventory, but the bunkhouse. The particular quality of the noise that came from it in the evenings was different. Less the low, resentful murmur of men who are waiting for things to get worse, more the ordinary sound of people who are tired from good work and are not afraid of tomorrow. Garrett noticed her noticing. Different, ain't it? He said. Not a question. They were standing in the yard after supper, the air cold and clean, the smokehouse breathing its steady smoke into the dark above them. Yes, she said. Men work different when they think it's going somewhere, he said. When we first got here 3 years back when Harlan still had cash reserve, and the operation was running right. It felt like this. Purposeful. He paused. Then the market turned, and the cash dried up, and it started feeling like we were just waiting to find out how bad the ending was going to be. And now, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Now it feels like there might not be a bad ending, he said. He sounded almost surprised by it, the way people sound when something they'd stopped believing in comes back. Margaret looked at the smokehouse. There won't be, she said. Not if I have anything to say about it. Garrett turned his head and looked at her, and in the dark, his face had dropped all the performance, all the authority posturing that he ran for the benefit of the other men, and what was underneath it was something younger and more honest, a man who had been afraid for a long time and was carefully, cautiously beginning to stop being afraid. Miss Doyle, he said. Margaret, she said, like she'd said to Tully, like she'd been saying one by one to the men of this ranch who had earned it. He nodded. Margaret. He turned back toward the bunkhouse. Good night? Good night, Garrett, she said. The twist came on a Wednesday. It arrived in the form of a rider, not Cobb's familiar lean figure, not a provisioner's representative, but a man she hadn't seen before riding a good horse and dressed in the kind of clothes that said territorial business rather than ranch work. He came into the yard at mid-morning and asked for William Harlan by name. Margaret was at the smokehouse and saw him arrive. Something in the set of his shoulders, the precise, careful posture of a man who brings news. He has been paid to deliver, rather than news. He personally carries, made her stop what she was doing, and watch. Harlan came out of the main house and met the rider in the yard. She watched them talk. She watched Harlan's body change, the slight stiffening across the shoulders, the way his hand moved once to his hat brim and then dropped. The rider handed him an envelope. Harlan looked at it. The rider mounted and left. Harlan stood in the yard for a long moment after the rider was gone. Then he went back inside. He didn't come out for 2 hours. Margaret finished her morning work and made the midday meal and set it on the table and let the men eat, and when the kitchen had emptied, she knocked on the study door. Come in, he said. His voice was flat, in a way it hadn't been since the first week. She came in. He was at his desk, the envelope open in front of him, the letter inside, spread flat. He wasn't reading it. He was just looking at it, the way people look at things they've already absorbed, but can't stop seeing. What is it? She said. He looked up. A lien, he said. From the Territorial Bank of Helena. I took out a loan 4 years ago against the East Pasture to cover the operating costs when the beef market dropped. The loan was structured on a 5-year term. He paused. They're accelerating the call. They want the full balance in 60 days. Margaret kept her face still. How much? She said. He told her. The number was large. Large enough that she understood immediately why he had sat in this room for 2 hours without coming out. Can the ranch account cover it? She said. No, he said. Not close. The first 2 contract payments from Hatch, she said. The second one is due in 3 weeks. Combined, they cover about a third of it, he said. She sat down. This was the first time she had sat down in his study without being invited to, and neither of them noticed. The bank, she said. Why are they accelerating the call now? A 5-year loan doesn't call early without a reason. Harlan's jaw tightened. They have the right to call early if they determine the asset the East Pasture has declined in value below the loan threshold. Has it? The land itself, no. The land is the same land it's always been. He paused. But they had it assessed last month by an assessor I didn't choose and wasn't notified about, and the assessment came back low, significantly low. Margaret was very still. An assessment you weren't notified about, she said slowly. The loan terms allow them to assess without prior notice, he said. I signed those terms 4 years ago. I should have read them more carefully. Who owns the Territorial Bank of Helena? She said. He looked at her. A syndicate, he said. 3 primary investors. It's a private bank. He paused. One of the investors is a man named Aldrich Crane. He runs a cattle operation 2 valleys east. We've been competing for the same provisioner contracts for years." The silence that followed was the kind where everything rearranges. Margaret looked at the letter on the desk. She looked at Harlan. "Crane knows about the Hatch contracts," she said. It wasn't a question. "Word travels in this territory," Harlan said. His voice had the particular flatness of a man who is working very hard to stay controlled. "If Crane knows we've secured provisioner contracts that stabilize this ranch's income contracts that compete directly with his own operation, then accelerating the loan call now, before the contracts can build enough revenue to pay down the balance, is the fastest legal way to force a sale," she said. "The East Pasture," Harlan said. "If they foreclose on it, we lose grazing capacity for 100 head. The cattle operation can't survive that reduction. And without the cattle operation, the ranch revenue picture changes enough that the smokehouse contracts alone can't carry the full operating costs," she said. "Yes," he said. She stood up. "I need to see the loan documents," she said. "Margaret." "All of them," she said. "The original agreement, the assessment notification, if there is one, the letter of acceleration, and any correspondence you've had with the bank since the loan was originated." She looked at him with the same absolute steadiness she'd brought to the smokehouse, to the Hatch negotiation, to every problem this ranch had put in front of her. "You showed me your financial ledger 6 weeks ago because you understood I needed to see the whole picture. This is the same thing. I need to see all of it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and placed a substantial file of papers on the table between them. She sat back down, and she began to read. It took her 3 hours. She read everything, not quickly, not skimming, but with the thorough, systematic attention her father had taught her to bring to any document where the details mattered and the consequences of missing something were permanent. She made notes in the margin of her own paper. She asked Harlan 4 questions at precise intervals, questions that required him to explain decisions and timelines and conversations he'd had with the bank over 4 years. He answered all of them. The answer she was looking for was buried in the original loan agreement on page 7 in a clause written in the dense, compact language of legal documents that most people sign without fully reading because they trust the person across the table to not be building a trap. She found it. "Here," she said. She turned the page toward him and put her finger on the line. He leaned over and read it. "The assessment provision," he said. "I know. They can assess without notice. Read the next sentence," she said. He read it. His face changed. "Assessment must be conducted by a licensed territorial assessor registered with the Montana Territory Land Office." He read slowly. "Yes," she said. "The assessor they used." "Was he registered?" she said. Harlan looked at her. Something was waking up behind his eyes. Something that had been sitting under 2 hours of defeat, trying to find a reason to move. "I don't know," he said. "Find out," she said. "Today, send a wire to the Territory Land Office and ask for the registration status of the assessor named in that letter." She tapped the acceleration notice. "His name is on the documentation. If he is not registered with the land office, the assessment is invalid under the terms of the loan agreement itself, which means the acceleration call is based on an invalid trigger." Harlan stared at her. "If the trigger is invalid," he started. "Then the acceleration is invalid," she said. "And you have grounds to contest it." He stood up so fast his chair scraped back. "Cobb's making a run to the telegraph office Friday," he said. "Today," she said. "Send someone today. Ride if you have to." He was already moving. He stopped at the door. "Margaret," he said. She looked up from the loan document. "How did you know to look for that?" he said. She thought about her father's butcher shop, about the way he had sat her down at 12 years old, with the lease agreement for the shop, and made her read every word of it, and then explain every word back to him, because he had told her that a woman who could not read a contract was a woman who would always be at the mercy of whoever wrote it. "My father," she said. "He taught me to read everything." Harlan left at a hard ride. 20 minutes later, Garrett's best horse under him, 20 miles to the telegraph office in town. The ranch was quiet with his absence, the kind of quiet that holds its breath. Margaret went back to the smokehouse. She couldn't do anything about the bank until the wire came back. What she could do was keep the operation moving, keep the cure cycle on schedule, keep the second delivery to Hatch's office on track. Standing still while waiting for important information was a kind of waste she had never been able to afford. Jonas found her at the fire pit feeding the oak in the precise measured way she'd taught him, each piece placed to maintain the temperature without spiking it. "Something's wrong," he said, not a question. He had lived in close enough proximity to this operation for 6 weeks to read the air of it. "Something's being addressed," she said. He was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. "Is the smokehouse safe?" he asked. He meant the contracts, the future, the thing they'd all been building. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I'm making sure of it." He nodded and went back to his work. The wire came back the next morning. Harlan rode back in before dawn and came straight to the kitchen, where Margaret was already up and at the stove, because she had not slept well, and work was the only answer she had for sleeplessness. He put the telegram on the table in front of her. She read it. The assessor who had evaluated the east pasture was not registered with the Montana Territory Land Office. His name did not appear in the active registry. He had held a registration that had expired 14 months ago and had not been renewed. The assessment was invalid. She read it twice. Then she put it down and looked at Harlan. His face was doing the thing it had done on the day she'd told him the ranch was going to survive, the particular expression of a man who has been holding himself braced for an impact that has not come, and is only now beginning to let the bracing go. "We contest it," she said, in writing today, citing the specific clause and the registration status. "You'll need a lawyer to file properly, but the grounds are solid." "I know a lawyer in Helena," he said. "He's handled ranch work before." "Contact him today," she said. "Already sent a wire from town last night," he said. "He'll be here by the end of the week." She looked at him. He had already done it. "Good," she said. "I learned from watching you," he said quietly. 3 steps ahead. The lawyer arrived on Thursday. His name was Beaumont, a spare, careful man who read the loan documents in the same room where Margaret had read them with the same thoroughness, and at the end of his reading looked up and said to both of them, "This is solid. The assessment clause violation is unambiguous. They'll know it the moment they receive the contest." "Will they fight it?" Harlan asked. "They may try to find another grounds for acceleration," Beaumont said, "but they don't have one. Your payment history is clean. The land value is demonstrably unchanged, and the only trigger they had was the assessment." He paused. "Crane will know he's lost this particular play." "Will he try another one?" Margaret said. Beaumont looked at her. "Almost certainly," he said. "A man who builds a mechanism to force a competitor out doesn't stop at the first failed attempt." The room was quiet. Margaret looked at the window. She thought about what Crane knew that the smokehouse was producing, that the contracts were real, that the Harlan Ranch was no longer dying. She thought about what he would do next, about the shape of a man who used legal instruments as weapons, about the fact that Crane had access to the bank, and the bank had access to documents she hadn't seen yet. "I need to see the full bank record," she said. "Not just the loan file, everything the bank holds related to this ranch." Beaumont looked at her carefully. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that if Crane used the bank once to try to injure this operation, he may have used it in other ways we haven't found yet," she said. "I want to know everything he knows about this ranch before he finds his next play." Beaumont looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at Margaret. "Can you get it?" he said to Beaumont. Beaumont considered for a moment. "I can file a discovery request as part of the contest proceeding," he said. "It'll take 2 weeks, maybe 3. "File it," Harlan said. "File it today," Margaret said. Beaumont almost smiled. Just a little. "Today," he agreed. When Beaumont had gone, Harlan and Margaret sat at the kitchen table in the particular quiet of 2 people who have just done everything they can do for the moment and are waiting for the world to respond. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. Outside, the smokehouse breathed its steady, patient smoke. "He's not done with us," Harlan said. "No," she agreed. "He's not." "Are you afraid?" he said. And the question was real, not testing her, not challenging her. Genuinely asking the way he had learned to genuinely ask her things, because she gave him genuine answers. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I'm not afraid of men who use paperwork as weapons. They always leave a paper trail." She looked at him. "That's the thing about men who work through documents and legal mechanisms. They trust the system to be invisible. But documents can be read by anyone who knows what to look for." He looked at her for a long moment. "Like you," he said. "Like me," she said. The wind outside moved across the prairie in that long, cold way it had, making the house creak and settle, making the fire pull slightly in the stove. Margaret wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and felt the warmth of it move through her palms and up into those aching joints that carried her father's work and her own. They were not safe yet, but they were not losing. And the difference between those two things, the specific hard-won ground between not losing and winning, was exactly the kind of territory that Margaret Doyle had been navigating her entire life. She knew every inch of it. The bank's response came 11 days after Beaumont filed the contest. It arrived not by rider this time, but by telegraph, which told Margaret something important before she even read the words. A rider carried a message that someone wanted delivered with the weight of physical presence. A telegraph was faster and colder, and chosen by people who wanted the communication to feel procedural rather than personal. The bank was retreating into formality, which meant they knew they had lost the legal ground and were deciding how to respond to that loss. She was right. The telegraph acknowledged the registration violation, withdrew the acceleration call, and reinstated the original loan terms. Harlan read it standing at the kitchen table. She watched his face and saw the relief move through him. Not the sharp, gasping relief of a man who has been rescued at the last moment, but the slower, deeper release of someone who has been carrying a weight for weeks and has finally been told he can set it down. "It's over," he said. "This part of it," she said. He looked at her. "Crane," she said. "Beaumont was right. He won't stop here." Harlan set the telegraph down. "Then we stay ready." "We stay ahead," she corrected. "There's a difference." The discovery documents from the bank arrived 4 days later, a thick packet of papers that Beaumont delivered in person, sitting across the kitchen table from both of them, with the careful expression of a lawyer who has found something he wasn't entirely expecting to find. "There's more here than the loan," Beaumont said. Margaret had already known there would be. She had known it since the moment she understood Crane had access to the bank's inner workings, because a man who uses one tool rarely uses only one tool. "Tell us," she said. Beaumont laid 3 documents on the table. The first was a letter from Crane to the bank's primary investor. Not a formal letter, but a private correspondence that had been included in the bank's files by the kind of clerical carelessness that happens in institutions where people believe certain documents will never be examined from the outside. In it, Crane discussed the Harlan Ranch, directly referred to it as a target for acquisition, outlined the loan acceleration strategy as the first of a 2-phase approach, and mentioned a second phase that involved a separate financial instrument. "What's the second phase?" Harlan said. His voice was level in the way things are level when they are working hard to stay that way. Beaumont placed the second document on the table. It was a deed. Specifically, it was a deed of conditional transfer, a document that established a mechanism by which, if the Harlan Ranch defaulted on the loan or failed to meet certain operating conditions, the East Pasture would transfer not to the bank as collateral, but to a land acquisition entity. Margaret leaned forward and read the name of the acquisition entity: Crane Territorial Holdings. "He set up a shell," she said flatly. "He did," Beaumont said. The bank was never the end destination for the land. The foreclosure would have transferred the East Pasture directly into Crane's land holdings, bypassing the normal public auction process that would have given other buyers the opportunity to bid. The kitchen was very quiet. Harlan's hand was flat on the table, completely still, the stillness of a man controlling something that wants to move. "That's fraud," he said. "It is a substantial legal irregularity," Beaumont said carefully. "Whether it rises to prosecutable fraud depends on how the conditional transfer was structured and whether it was properly disclosed at the time the loan was originated." He paused. "It was not disclosed. Your signature on the loan documents was obtained without informing you of the conditional transfer mechanism." "He tricked me into signing," Harlan said. "Yes," Beaumont said. "In plain language, yes." Margaret picked up the third document. It was a list of correspondence between Crane and someone at the bank's assessment office dated 8 months ago, before the assessment had even been conducted. In it, Crane specified the range of value he needed the assessment to return in order to trigger the acceleration clause. He had told them what number to produce before they had set foot on the Harlan land. She read it twice. Then she placed it on the table and looked at Beaumont. "This is enough," she said. "To contest the loan, yes, which we've already won," he said. "To pursue Crane legally, we would need to file a complaint with the territorial court and potentially the federal land office given the interstate nature of the bank's charter." "Then file it," she said. Beaumont looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at Margaret. There was a conversation in that exchange that had no words, the conversation of two people who have been through enough together that the important things no longer require full sentences. She saw him weigh it, the cost of pursuing Crane, the time it would take, the possibility that Crane had more resources for a legal fight than the Harlan Ranch did, the very real chance that even with good evidence, the territorial legal system moved slowly and Crane moved fast. She saw him weigh all of it, and she saw him decide. "File it," he said to Beaumont. "Everything. The non-disclosure, the rigged assessment, the shell entity. All of it." Beaumont nodded once. He began gathering the documents back into his case with the organized efficiency of a man who had been hoping someone would say exactly that. "I'll need a few days to structure the complaint properly. I want it to be complete when we file, no gaps for Crane to exploit." "Take what you need," Harlan said. But not longer. After Beaumont left the kitchen, held that particular silence again, the one that had become familiar over the past weeks. The silence that came after large things had been decided, and before the world had responded to the decision. Harlan sat back in his chair. He looked tired in a way that was different from work tired. He looked like a man who had been fighting on two fronts simultaneously, the visible fight to build the ranch back up, and the invisible fight against something that had been working against him without his knowledge, and the weight of both at once had settled somewhere in his face. "He's been planning this for 8 months, Harlan said. "While I was borrowing that money to keep the operation alive, he was already building the mechanism to take it from me." "Yes," she said. "If you hadn't read the loan documents," he said. "If you hadn't found the assessment clause—" "I did read them," she said. "That's what matters." "Margaret." He said her name the way he'd been saying it for weeks now, not as address, but as something more specific, the way you say the name of someone who has become essential. "I need to ask you something." She waited. "When you wrote back to Hatch's office the first time," he said, "before you showed me his letter, before we had any agreement in writing," he paused. "Why did you do it that way? You could have come to me first. You could have let me lead the correspondence." She looked at him for a moment. "Because I had been in enough situations by that point in my life," she said quietly, "where I did the work and then handed the result to someone else and watched my name disappear from it. Not always through malice. Sometimes just through the natural way things arrange themselves when a woman does something exceptional and the man next to her is the one with the title." She met his eyes. "I wasn't willing to let that happen here. So I established the relationship in my name first, and then came to you. Because I trusted you to honor it once it existed. But I needed it to exist first." The silence after that was different from the others. Harlan looked at her for a long time. "I would have honored it," he said. "I believe you," she said. "But I've believed that before and been wrong. I needed more than belief." He nodded slowly. Not hurt, not defensive. the nod of a man absorbing something true and finding it fair. "I understand," he said. "I know you do," she said. Against Crane was filed on a Thursday, 9 days after Beaumont had taken the documents. It went to the territorial court in Helena, and a copy was sent simultaneously to the Federal Land Office in Washington, because Beaumont had determined that the interstate bank charter made federal jurisdiction applicable, and he wanted Crane to face pressure from both directions at once. Word reached the ranch 4 days after filing through Cobb, who had heard it at the telegraph office. Crane's lawyer had appeared at the territorial court within 48 hours, which meant Crane had learned of the filing almost immediately and had responded with the speed of a man who had something serious to protect. "He's scared," Jonas said when Margaret told him that evening. She had started telling Jonas the important developments not because he needed to know them for his smokehouse work, but because she had come to understand that the operation they were building together required him to understand the whole of it, not just his part. He was going to run this operation one day. She had known it for weeks, and you don't build a leader by keeping them in the dark about the forces that shape their world. "He's responding," she said. "Scared and responding aren't always the same thing. A smart, scared man is more dangerous than a confident one." "What does he do next?" Jonas asked. "That's what we're watching for," she said. What Crane did next surprised her, not in its intent, in its method. She had expected another legal instrument, another mechanism, another document-based maneuver, because that was the pattern she had read in the evidence, a man who preferred to act at a distance through systems with the protective layer of process between himself and the consequences of his actions. What he sent instead was a person. A woman arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning, arriving by hired carriage rather than on horseback, which was the first thing that registered as unusual. She was well dressed by territory standards, not ostentatiously, but deliberately the clothes of someone who wants to be taken seriously rather than admired. She asked for William Harlan by name, and when Harlan came out to meet her in the yard, she introduced herself as a representative of a Helena investment group that was interested in the smokehouse operation, interested in acquiring it. Margaret was at the smokehouse when Jonas came to find her. His face was carrying the specific expression of someone who doesn't know exactly what they've seen, but knows it matters. "There's a woman in the yard talking to Harlan," he said. "She came in a carriage. She's talking about buying the smokehouse." Margaret put down what she was holding. She walked out of the smokehouse and across the yard without hurrying, because hurrying would have told everyone watching that she was rattled, and she was not rattled. She was, in fact, something closer to the opposite, the particular sharpening of focus that happens when a pattern you have been anticipating finally shows itself clearly. The woman saw her coming before Harlan did. Her eyes moved to Margaret and assessed her with the same quick professional attentiveness that Hatch had used the gaze of someone who has been in rooms where the important person wasn't the one with the title and has learned to look for who is actually running things. Harlan turned. "Margaret." "I heard," she said. She looked at the woman. "What's the offer?" The woman blinked slightly, not from surprise exactly, but from the adjustment of recalibrating who she needed to speak to. "The offer is quite generous," she said. "My clients are prepared to purchase the smokehouse operation, including all existing contracts, equipment, and process documentation at a price that would significantly improve the ranch's overall financial position." "Your clients," Margaret said. "What investment group?" "Helena Capital Partners," the woman said. "And who holds the primary interest in Helena Capital Partners?" Margaret said. A pause. Just barely a pause. But Margaret caught it. "That's not information I'm authorized to share in this context," the woman said. "Then we don't have anything to discuss," Margaret said pleasantly. The woman looked at her, then at Harlan, then back at Margaret. "Miss Doyle," she said, "I understand you have a personal investment in this operation. My clients are prepared to honor that investment to include a personal payment to you as part of the acquisition terms above and beyond the ranch's purchase price." The yard was very quiet. Garrett had appeared from the direction of the barn without appearing to have moved toward them. Tully was near the grain shed not working. Jonas stood 10 feet back still. Margaret looked at the woman with complete, untroubled steadiness. "Ma'am," she said, "the smokehouse is not for sale. The operation is not for sale. The contracts are not for sale. And whatever your clients told you about what it would take to change my mind, they told you wrong." She paused one beat. "You rode a long way for a short conversation. I'm sorry about that. There's coffee in the kitchen if you need something before you go back." The woman looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded once with something in her face that was not defeat, but was the professional recognition of a wall that is not going to move. She left without the coffee. Harlan waited until the carriage was out of the yard. Then he turned to Margaret and said, "Crane?" "Crane," she confirmed. "He sent her to buy what he couldn't take," he said. "And when buying failed," she said, "to try to separate me from the operation with a personal offer. Divide us." She glanced at him. "It's not a stupid strategy. If I had taken it, you'd have lost the person running the operation and the institutional knowledge she carries. The contracts would have become difficult to maintain. The ranch's position would have weakened." "But you didn't take it?" he said. "No," she said. "Why not?" he said. And again, it was a real question, the question of a man who wanted to understand something, not test it. "The offer was likely significant. You could have taken that money and started something of your own, somewhere of your own." She looked at the smokehouse. She looked at the yard at Garrett, pretending not to have been standing guard at Tully, pretending to work at Jonas, still waiting at the edge of the scene, because he hadn't been dismissed and didn't want to leave. She looked at Harlan. "Because this is mine," she said. "Not the building, not the equipment. This what we built here, what these men are part of, what this operation has become. I don't leave things I've built. Not for money. Not for an easier road." She paused. "And because Crane wanted me to. That alone was reason enough to stay." Harlan looked at her. Something moved across his face that had been building for weeks. Something that had started as reluctant respect and moved through trust and was now in territory that neither of them had named yet, but that both of them could feel the shape of the way. You can feel the shape of a door in the dark before you find the handle. "Margaret," he said. "Not yet," she said quietly. "Finish the legal matter first. Then we can talk about everything else." He understood what she meant, and he nodded. The territorial court ruled 6 weeks later. The ruling was unambiguous in the way that rulings are when the evidence is clear and the misconduct is documented and the opposing party has run out of procedural delays to hide behind. The conditional transfer deed was voided. The rigged assessment was formally invalidated with a finding of fraudulent intent. The original loan was restructured under court supervision with a payment schedule that reflected the ranch's actual and now substantially improved financial position. Crane was not criminally charged. Beaumont had warned them this was likely that the territorial legal system in 1883 moved cautiously on charges against wealthy men with institutional connections, and that a civil judgment with financial penalties was the practical ceiling of what they could achieve. Margaret had listened to this assessment and accepted it without bitterness, because she understood that justice and the legal system were related but not identical, and that the practical result, the void deed, the invalidated assessment, the restructured loan, and the permanent court record, establishing that Aldrich Crane had attempted to fraudulently acquire land from a private ranch owner, was not nothing. It was in fact a great deal. It was documentation, and documentation, as her father had taught her, lasted longer than memory. The day the ruling arrived, Harlan read it at the kitchen table with Beaumont sitting across from him, and when he finished reading it, he set it down and sat for a moment, and then put his face briefly into his hands, not in grief, but in the particular physical response of a man who has been holding something tightly for so long that the release of it requires his whole body to register. Beaumont quietly gathered his papers. Margaret put a cup of coffee in front of Harlan. He looked up. His eyes were red at the edges. He didn't try to hide it. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she agreed. Beaumont left them. The kitchen held the evening light that came through the west-facing window in November, long and golden and without warmth, the kind of light that is beautiful specifically because it is ending. They sat with it for a moment. "I want to show you something," Harlan said. He got up and went to the study and came back with a document she hadn't seen. He placed it on the table in front of her. She looked at it. It was a deed. Not the Crane deed, not the instrument of theft that had been voided by the court. A new deed. The Harlan Ranch all parcels, including the east pasture, properly filed with the Territorial Land Office. Her name was on it, not as a signature witness, not as a secondary party. As a co-owner, listed beside his in the formal language of territorial property law with equal legal standing on all parcels. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at his handwriting in the margins, notes he had made, corrections, the evidence of a document that had been drafted and considered carefully, not quickly. He had been working on this for weeks, before the Crane woman had arrived, before the court ruling. He had been working on this while everything else was happening. "William," she said. "You said to finish the legal matter first," he said. "Then we could talk about everything else." He sat back down across from her. "The legal matter is finished." She looked at him. He was watching her with the same directness he'd had from the beginning. That combination of pride and stubbornness that she had learned to read as a language, had learned to hear the vulnerability inside. But underneath it now was something else, something that had grown in the months they had spent working side by side in the cold and the difficulty and the accumulated weight of building something from nearly nothing. Something that looked in the November kitchen light considerably like what it was. "This isn't just a business arrangement," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." "You understand what you're proposing," she said. "Not a challenge, a careful, necessary clarity. I understand that this ranch is nothing without you," he said. "I understand that I brought you here for a purpose, and you exceeded it in every possible direction, and I have spent 4 months watching you work and thinking and fighting and being exactly what you are, and I—" He stopped, gathered himself. "I am not a man who is good with words, Margaret. You know that." "I know that," she said. "But I am a man who honors what he signs," he said. "And I am asking you to sign this with me, not because the ranch needs it, because I need it." He paused. "Because you are the only person in my life, the only person in a very long time who has told me the truth without flinching, held the ground without asking permission, and stayed when leaving would have been easier." His voice was quiet now, stripped down to the thing underneath. "I would like you to stay, not as an employee, not as a partner in the business sense, as my partner, in every sense there is." The kitchen was very still. Outside the smokehouse, stood in the long evening light, the smoke rising patient and certain into the darkening November sky. The ranch stretched beyond it. The ordered yard, the repaired fence line, the well-fed horses in the corral. The bunkhouse where 22 men were ending a day of purposeful work. All of it transformed from what it had been 4 months ago when she had stepped off a wagon into a yard full of resentment and despair. She looked at all of it through the kitchen window. She looked at the deed with both their names on it. She looked at William Harlan, at the hard jaw and the careful eyes, and the man underneath who had learned in 4 months to put the ledger on the table and share the full picture and trust the person across from him with the real weight of things. She picked up the pen. She signed. He signed beside her. The ink dried in the warm air of the kitchen, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there was nothing that needed to be said. The document said it, and the months behind them said it, and the smoke rising from the smokehouse outside said it in the patient, enduring language of something that has been built to last. Then Jonas knocked on the back door. She had forgotten he was still out there. "Come in," she called. He came in, hat in hand, his face carrying the careful look of a young man who knows he's interrupting something, but has a real reason. "Second batch of the expansion is ready for the racks," he said. "I wanted to know if you wanted to check it before I hang it, or if I should just go ahead." Margaret looked at him. She looked at the capable, precise, purposeful young man he had become in 4 months. The boy who had arrived with big hands and a hog farmer's instincts, and had grown into someone who managed cure cycles without supervision, logged his records with typeset precision, and asked the right question at the right moment, because he understood the difference between seeking approval and seeking information. "Go ahead," she said. "You don't need me to check it. You know what right looks like." He looked at her for one moment with an expression she recognized, the look of someone who has just been handed the full weight of something they are ready to carry and knows it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He went back out. The smokehouse door closed behind him with the particular solid sound of a structure that has been properly maintained and is doing exactly what it was built to do. The days that followed had a different quality from everything that came before. Not easier. The work didn't become easier. The cold didn't relent. The territory's demands didn't soften. But there was a wholeness to it that hadn't existed before, the particular quality of a life that has found its shape and is moving through the world in that shape, with intention and without apology. The hatch contracts expanded as she had promised. 4 by December the 5th confirmed for spring. Harlan's cattle operation stabilized on the revenue the smokehouse provided, which freed him to make decisions about the herd from a position of strength rather than desperation. The east pasture remained grazed properly, managed with the care that comes from knowing the land is yours and will remain yours. Colbert left in November, not fired, just gone. The particular departure of a man who understands that the situation has resolved in a direction he can't reverse, and that his presence is a constant reminder of a choice he made that cost him nothing except the respect of every person around him. Nobody mourned his going. Nobody said anything when he left. Garrett stayed. He stayed and became in the way that certain people do when the circumstances finally match their capabilities, something larger than he had been. The kind of foreman who ran a crew through respect rather than through the performance of authority. Who came to Margaret with practical problems and genuine questions, rather than with the posturing that had characterized his first weeks. She and he developed the particular professional relationship of two people who started as adversaries and arrived at something that was not friendship exactly, but was better than friendship in certain ways, the clean, honest working alliance of people who know each other's real measure and have stopped pretending otherwise. Tully repaired the smokehouse door in January for the second time, not because it had failed, but because he decided he could do it better, and he did it with the particular craftsmanship of a man who has been given a reason to bring his best work to something. Jonas ran the cure cycle for the first full week without Margaret present in February, when she spent a week in Helena with Beaumont and Harlan finalizing the legal and financial restructuring. The batch he produced in her absence was by every measurable standard equal to any she had produced herself. When she returned and tasted the results, she didn't say it was good. She said, "You're ready." He knew what she meant. He didn't say anything. But she saw it in his face, the quiet, settled pride of a person who has become what they set out to become and found the reality of it even better than the idea. The spring came hard and bright, the way Montana springs do. Sudden cold edge still at night, the grass coming up urgent and green, as though making up for lost time. The ranch moved into it with the particular confidence of an operation that has survived its worst and knows the shape of its own resilience. On a morning in early April, Margaret stood at the smokehouse in the early light, the air carrying that particular cold spring smell of thawed earth and new wood smoke, and the long patient scent of cured meat, the smell that had become over 6 months, the smell of everything she had built. Harlan came to stand beside her. They had been married in February in a small courthouse ceremony in Helena with Beaumont as witness, and Cobb as the second, because neither of them needed an occasion to be what they already were. They needed a document, and they had gotten one which was entirely in keeping with who they both were. "Hatch's man is coming Thursday," he said. "I know," she said. "Jonas will handle the delivery meeting. He doesn't need me there." Harlan looked at her sideways. "You're sure?" "He's been ready for 6 weeks," she said. "I just hadn't given him the official space to do it." He nodded. They stood together in the spring morning, watching the smoke rise from the building that had once been a forgotten, rusted, half-collapsed relic of a better time. The building that she had walked into in October and seen not as it was, but as what it could be made to be. "Where did you learn all of it?" Harlan asked. "Not just the smokehouse. All of it, the reading of contracts, the thinking ahead, the way you understand people before they've finished their sentences." She had been waiting, without knowing it, for him to ask this question. Not because the answer was complicated, but because the answer mattered, and she had wanted to be asked in the right moment the way certain things deserve to be asked in the right moment, rather than in the middle of a crisis. "My father," she said. "He was a butcher for 30 years, a craftsman. He understood that what he did, the preservation of things, the extending of their usefulness beyond the moment, was not a small skill. It was a fundamental one." She paused. "He told me once that people underestimate preservation. They think it's about holding things the same, but it's not. It's about understanding what something is at its best, and protecting that quality through time and difficulty and changing conditions. So that what comes out the other side is not a pale version of what went in, but the truest version." She looked at the smokehouse. "He taught me that with meat," she said. "I learned it applied to everything." Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then, "He was a wise man." "He was a butcher," she said, "which is the same thing if you pay attention." The morning light came over the ridge to the east, gold and clear, catching the smoke from the smokehouse and turning it luminous for a moment, that brief particular beauty that happens when ordinary things are struck by the right light at the right angle and become briefly extraordinary before the light moves on and ordinary reasserts itself. The Harlan Ranch in that light looked like what it had become, not what it had been before the debt and the desperation and the empty smokehouse and the telegram that had said only capable woman needed, not the failing, frightened, hungry thing of October. What it had become. An operation with purpose and structure, and 2 names on the deed, and 22 men who ate well, and worked with intention, and had stopped bracing for a bad ending. A smokehouse that breathed steady and constant, filling its contracts, meeting its standards. Running now under the capable hands of a young man who had come west from a hog farm with big hands and a serious face, and had been pointed in a direction worth going. A woman who had walked into an empty room and seen what it could hold. She had not been sent here to save a broken thing. She had been the one capable of building what came after it. And what came after it was this solid earning, enduring a life and an operation and a name on a deed and a smokehouse that would still be standing and producing long after the people who built it had passed into the particular kind of immortality that comes not from monuments, but from things that continue to function, continue to provide, continue to feed people, long after the hands that built them have stilled. Margaret Doyle. Margaret Harlan on the deed. Though she used both names because both names were hers, and she had earned them both. Stood in the April morning and breathed the cold smoke-carrying air and felt it in those aching hands that were her father's hands and her own hands and the hands of every woman who had ever walked into a room that didn't want her and stayed long enough to make it hers. She had not come here to be wanted. She had come here to build something that lasts. And she had done exactly that in the only way that anything real has ever been built, not by waiting for permission, not by making herself smaller so the room felt larger, not by flinching when the world pushed back, but by knowing what she knew, doing what she could do, and refusing with every breath and every day and every signature on every document to let anyone or anything convince her that she was anything less than what she was. A woman who knew the value of things. A woman who knew how to make them last. And in the end, that had been and always would be more than enough.